Hi, everyone. The following is a conversation on the Getting Simple podcast with Andy Payne. So as you can see, we're testing video this time as well. And I hope that you enjoy it. Hey, it's Nono. And this is the Getting Simple podcast. I've met Andy for many years now, but we hadn't seen each other in person too much.
Been a while.
Right?
Yeah.
So digging a bit on you, I see that you're, as I am, like a licensed architect, right?
That's right.
And you also specialized in computational design.
Yeah.
And you were at Harvard, so it's your thesis there, and maybe we can learn a bit more about what exactly you did. And then later you've passed through Autodesk with the acquisition of Monolith.
That's right.
Tesla.
A little bit.
Contracting a bit.
Cup of coffee at Tesla.
Yeah. Proving ground. And now Andy's working at McNeel.
That's right.
Who are the people who develop both Rhino and Grasshopper 3D. So I also saw you have this Lift Architects, right? This is that like an architecture studio? Is that still going?
It was always sort of an outlet for me for sort of creative research. Back in the early 2000s when I started it, it was sort of an outpost for the research that I was doing just on the side. So I was working as a day, I was working as an architect at SOM and some other places. But then at night and on weekends, I was sort of exploring different avenues of research that I was interested in. And I would post stuff, mainly started as a blog, but post stuff on my website that I started as a Lift Architect. So it's not really a traditional architecture firm. I'm not really doing or looking necessarily right now for a whole lot of like built projects, but it is a vehicle where I can, as I teach and things like that, the money I get from teaching and stuff goes into that stuff.
Yeah, I think we can talk about teaching afterwards as well. So the first question would be like, why do you do what you do?
I enjoy it. Why does anybody do what they do? They hopefully most of the people that enjoy what they do, they do it because of the passion that they have for it. For me, it's always been about a curiosity of learning. I've always sort of been attracted to the computer and what can it do. I remember even in undergraduate, it wasn't the most computationally driven program necessarily back in the day, but I was always trying to push the boundary a little bit. I think my first 3D program was called Form Z, if you remember that program. And the renderings were fine. I tried to do the best I could with it. But I would look in, magazines and things like that from other schools and just wonder how they did those renderings. Because I knew what I could do in Form Z, and it wasn't that. Like I kind of pushed Form Z to its limit at the time, and I couldn't do what these renderings were doing. So I was always sort of attracted to what other people are looking at, what are they doing, and how are they doing it. And so how can I sort of participate in that conversation? And so that sort of led me to Columbia, which was doing a lot of that cutting edge back in the late 90s and or even early 90s and then 2000s. And so that's sort of where my joy of computational design sort of took off, because I was able to start learning some of those techniques while I was at school.
When was that? So what year?
So I graduated from undergraduate in 2002 and then went straight to Columbia. So 2002 to 2005. I've
been looking a bit also at the evolution of Grasshopper. We were talking the other day about Grasshopper 2.0, but can you tell us a bit how Grasshopper turned from record history to explicit history to like Grasshopper 0 point something?
Yeah.
And what has been the evolution, or how did this visual, well, maybe you can kind of go even a bit farther back, like
it's like you're reading my mind, because I was even going to take a step back further. And as I was saying, while I was at Columbia, the two programs that they were really pushing at that time were 3D Max and Maya, and I tended to be on the 3D Max side, but I was really, as typical, just trying to explore and push where I could. And so I was looking at IKEA systems and things like that. But then I was able to realize that you could sort of make these really not efficient, but make these sliders and tie a slider to a property in the 3D Max panel back in 2005. And that was kind of new. But so I made these like little interfaces where I could drive parametrically things in the 3D Max view. And I didn't even start Rhino. I think that in that same year is when I actually tried Rhino for the first time and really liked it. But then when I saw this example of explicit history come out in, what was it, 2007, 2006-ish, I think, it totally clicked for me because I'd already tried doing this stuff with 3D Max. And now this was a much more intuitive way. But in my brain, it just sort of was like, this is what I've been trying to do. And now I can do it, so much easier and quicker. And so for me, my intro into explicit history and then what ended up becoming Grasshopper 1 was this avenue that I'd been exploring through 3D Max and then realized there was this much more intuitive interface. But now that I could do those same things in Rhino and in Grasshopper. And so that was sort of and the other thing for me was that in my day job, I was doing a lot of rendering. That was sort of my intro out of school. I had done a lot of that in graduate school. And so I got kind of pushed into rendering pretty hard at my first jobs. And while I enjoyed it for a little while, it wasn't necessarily something I really wanted to do full time. Not to knock that. A lot of people kind of go down that career path, but I ended up trying to do whatever I could to not do rendering. And then one of the really neat things about Grasshopper and Rhino, at least at the time, was that it was the anti-renderer. It only had the semi-transparent red color for all of the objects. You could sort of control a little bit of the display stuff, but you didn't render at all. It was not about rendering. And so that also was appealing to me, to sort of jump into a program and really push it and not have to like focus on the visualization aspect and only doing that. So, then I was working for an architecture firm. I will sort of talk about that project that I was mentioning just a minute ago. How I ended up sort of getting into Grasshopper, or at least explicit history, was I had worked at an architecture firm where we did a project where they coupled an architect with a chef. It was for an event called Slow Food Nation back in 2007, 2008. And again, I think Grasshopper at this point was still called Explicit History. It had only been out probably 6 months or something. And for this design, the architect had to design some sort of tasting pavilion for the chef to display their food. And we got coupled with a chef who specialized in pickles and chutney. So we realized kind of early on in talking with her that throughout the world they pickle food in mason jars. So we really wanted to use that as the vehicle for the design of the project. And so we ended up designing this sort of undulated ceiling out of mason jar lids. So we suspended mason jar lids, like I think 3,000 mason jar lids at different heights to form like a very fluid kind of surface. And in order to do that, I used explicit history to coordinate all of the data, give me the links, output everything to Excel so that I could print out everything on, a spreadsheet, hand it to the people, because we would end up having these big, we called them pickle parties, where people would come and help us measure each of the lengths and, cut it. And so really for me, explicit history became really critical in the process of that, managing information of the design and then outputting for the fabrication, even though it was sort of a manual fabrication process. And so a colleague of mine at CCA had seen that project in San Francisco and asked if I would do a workshop for his class in like around January. And I realized if I'm going to try to teach a workshop, I need to know what the software does. And so I really started creating an outline for the workshop, and that ballooned into like a 40-page document. And so I was like, I'll just publish this online. This was sort of the first iteration, or maybe it was even 70 pages. I can't remember, but that ended up becoming the first version of the Grasshopper Primer. and I just released it online. And then I teamed up with Raja Issa from McNeel, and we sort of added even more documentation, and that became sort of the larger version that is available, I think, still today.
Yeah, so that is a PDF document, at least how I got it. Like maybe you can also print it. That talks through all of the basics of what Grasshopper is, the interface, like how you can drag and drop nodes and start connecting them to program. So there was this concept of a recording button on the interface that would record the steps that you did in Rhino.
You can still do it.
And you can still do it?
Yeah.
Okay,
it's still embedded in there.
Okay, and the concept was like it was tracing what you were doing, but the parameters that you had chosen you could change, right? And then David Ratten decided to make it more explicit, and that's why it changed to explicit history, and then I think sometime later became Grasshopper.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact timing. We should set up an interview with David to really get the background. But I remember it was.
You should hook me up.
I will. I can. But it was probably 6 months, 8 months, maybe even a year that it was called, I think, Explicit History. And then it ended up sort of becoming a more full-fledged plugin that he started calling Grasshopper.
Cool. So that initially came, you had to install it separately. Now it ships with Rhino.
Yep. It used to be a standalone or its own plugin that you would download. And, there's probably several people, early adopters, who remember the early days of Grasshopper 1 development. It was a really exciting time because everything changed so quickly. If those people who know David Redden, he's kind of a tour de force from a programming side. And it seemed like he was issuing new updates, daily or weekly. And that was kind of the fun of it, right? Seeing what was new, what he was adding. It was frustrating at times. I remember teaching a large workshop in San Francisco, and literally the day before the workshop started, he introduced the concept of data trees, which, if anybody's used Grasshopper in the audience, data trees are pretty critical, but also takes a little bit of mental comprehension to try to understand what data trees do and how they work. And so we all scrambled, the other workshop instructors were all trying to figure out how these data trees work so that we could obviously teach the rest of the participants. But, it was an exciting time then, and it still is, but, it had a really frenetic energy at the early days that I think was really compelling too.
And if I'm not wrong, that was a one-person project, right? It was mainly David.
Pretty much, especially early on. Obviously, there's been some contributors here or there, but even today, it's still majority of his work. I've been doing some stuff recently, some contributions here and there are certainly been a number of things that have been added that he necessarily wasn't involved. He's kind of, over the last several years, taken a step and really focused on Grasshopper 2. So a lot of the Grasshopper 1 development is now sort of not necessarily not handled by him, but he's sort of handed off some of that responsibility to other developers in-house so that he could focus on Grasshopper 2 development. And for those who aren't aware, Grasshopper 2 has been released. It's been out for about 6 months, but it's a complete rewrite from the ground up. So it's taken him several years, but the results are pretty compelling because everything's multi-threaded now. He's kind of overhauled the entire interface. And so it's a complete rewrite, and it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I guess also I wanted to refer to the idiosyncratic nature of some of the controls and things. It seems like he had a lot of fun building some of those custom. It's beautiful also, right? Like it has some controls that maybe you don't see on other places or that have a really interesting way of working.
Yeah, you think he enjoys what he does, but he obviously enjoys really the user experience. And he spends a lot of time and craft trying to make the user experience as joyful as he can, I think, for the users. And that's really, I think, how Grasshopper has spread so much, is that people do tend to enjoy working in it. They find little features here and there that, not necessarily Easter eggs, and he doesn't hide them necessarily, but there's little things that you end up finding like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. That's neat. Like he added this thing, or he'll add little words or, just the way he actually phrases things and presents things to users is pretty interesting. And I think that really goes a long way of having a, joyful experience when you're using the program.
So one thing I'm curious about, you have developed your own plugins, right? I've seen like Firefly or I don't remember, what was the other?
There was a monolith plugin, there's Firefly. For a brief time, I worked on Lunchbox ML when I was at the Proving Ground. So there was an ML, machine learning plugin that I was working on. And now I'm working on some native tools in Grasshopper 1. But that's basically kind of like a plugin, right? You're developing a series of components that do something.
So how does it feel to, you were more or less like a third-party developer, adding plugins that people could opt in, but now how does it feel to be like a developer? You're like, what you're putting there, it's going to be used. I mean, it's going to be available for everyone.
Well, first of all, I think my background into making those plugins accelerated my onboarding with McNeel, right? I felt kind of day one, I knew, I knew what I was doing. I knew sort of how the code base worked. I knew how Grasshopper worked. And so I have worked at other places where, we're working on different technology stacks that I'm not as fluent in. And, the learning curve to kind of get up to speed can take a little while. And so it was kind of refreshing to just kind of step in when I got hired and sort of be able to start contributing kind of really quickly. It's been great. A lot of the stuff that we're working on now for Grasshopper 1, for Rhino 8, is probably long overdue. But I think is going to really change or enhance the way people work with it. Do you want me to explain a little bit about some of the new tools that we're working on?
Yeah, go ahead.
The short elevator pitch for it, I guess, are some of the new tools that we've just released, like within the last week or two, is new expanded data types for Grasshopper. So, if anybody's used Grasshopper 1 over the last 10 years, they're familiar with all the data types that we currently have: points and lines and curves and surfaces and B-reps and meshes. We use most of those common ones. There are even some ones we don't use that often, like date time and matrices and things like that. But it's never had a concept of like native Rhino layers or even native Rhino materials or line types or hatches or annotations. There's still a bunch of data types that are native to Rhino that Grasshopper has no idea about or how to consume those or create those. So one of the things that we've been adding to Grasshopper 1 are these expanded data or these new data types that now allow you to not only query, say, a document for these types, like a layer, right? A query for a layer just gives you all the layers that are currently in the document, and look at all of its attributes, right? An attribute being, just a property that makes up that type. So a layer has a name, a display color, its visibility, things like that, line type. And so you can bring those into Grasshopper now and look at all of those attributes, but you can also create those attributes and create a new layer, bake it basically the same way you would bake geometry into the document. Now you bake a layer and it adds it to the layer table. Same thing with materials and line types and hatches. And so we're pretty excited about how this will hopefully help users be able to, modify their workflow. But also I think there's going to be some really interesting new tools that we're continue to add that just expands on those capabilities. So
you've also been working on Rhino.Compute, right? Can you tell us a bit of what that is or what the work that you've been doing is?
So Rhino.Compute, in a basic form, is we were able to take all of Rhino and compile it into a DLL that can be run as an executable. So what that means is it's essentially, for lack of a better term, Rhino without a user interface. And so we were able to create a little server that is running Rhino in the background. And you can send it HTTP requests to perform some sort of calculation. So anything that Rhino can do from a geometry calculation, all of Grasshopper and Rhino's geometry kernel is now exposed through Rhino.Compute. And you can do that you can send requests to perform those calculations. one of the things we realized kind of early on is that we need a client to be able to talk to that server. And so we developed a component for Grasshopper called Hops. And what that lets you do is essentially bundle up a Grasshopper file and send through Hops. It'll send that file that you point it to, send that file as an HTTP request to the Rhino.Compute server. It will do the calculation and then return the results. So that's the basics of it. When you install Hops, it will then also install Rhino.Compute and run a local server. So you can run it on your computer and do some debugging or testing locally without incurring any kind of expense or anything like that. It's free. And then once you get your workflow set up, however you're using Hops to send information back and forth, you can then deploy Rhino.Compute on a remote server, right? Somewhere, a virtual machine somewhere in the cloud. And then you can point Hops to send those requests there. And so in that way, you can really start setting up a production environment. You can, if you have a lower grade machine for users, but you want to do some simulation or some really highly intensive computational task, you could have a virtual machine that has a lot of RAM, a lot of CPU processing power, and send those requests to that machine to do that and sort of speed things up. I think one of the interesting use cases too is that because it takes HTTP requests, you can talk to it really from any client that can send an HTTP request. So we're seeing lots of people create web interfaces or application, iOS apps and things like that send these requests to a backend, a server that's running Rhino, and then come back with the results and then show it on the display. So like web configurators and things like that for furniture, jewelry. We're seeing a lot of really interesting use cases that, people who are interested in making a really simplified user interface, but something that you can give to say non-technical people or designers and still want to be able to view analysis, some results, or see the changes that they're making on the configurator. They can still see that result and then export the geometry to some sort of fabrication or anything like that. So it opens up a lot of possibilities.
Because I know that much of the core of Rhino and Grasshopper is being ported to .NET. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's 7, right? The new
6.
6, okay. Are there any plans in the future to maybe support other architectures that are not Windows in any of the capabilities? Because that probably, that would open doors in terms of maybe having a Linux instance that might be cheaper to run some things, or in terms of relying on Windows and because having a Windows instance on the cloud is more expensive, right? As well.
I don't know. I haven't really tried to price out Linux VMs or anything like that. I don't know if it's more expensive or not. I can tell, that's probably a little bit above my pay grade in making those decisions. I don't think there's a whole lot of drive to make Rhino.Compute necessarily run on a Linux machine. Rhino has historically it's only been a Windows program, but we've made a big push over the last 5 years to really make it cross-compatible with Mac OS. And so we do have a Mac version of Rhino. But from a Rhino.Compute perspective at the moment, it's really focused on, Windows-based machines. So usually running Windows Server or things like that. But, in my experience in setting up these virtual machines through AWS or Azure, really anywhere, they can be fairly reasonable. And you can always start small, right? One of the other things we've really tried to do with the way we've configured Rhino.Compute is we've got sort of a 2-layer architecture. And I think I was trying to explain this the other day to you. The way when you deploy it in a production environment, as I said, when you run it locally, it's free. You pay for your license, but other than that, you can run it and hit Hops and then compute all day long. When you deploy it in a production environment, which is going to be running Windows Server, we have a little bit different of a licensing model. It's what we call core hour billing. And it's essentially the number of cores on that machine times the number of hours that you're using. And so you can kind of start small. You could configure a really small VM, see if your users, are using it for testing, deployment. But if you start to have a lot more traffic and it's starting to slow down, you can always, increase the number of cores or the machine configuration. But what we've tried with this 2-layer architecture, we have a parent project sort of that we're calling Rhino.Compute, and then that stays up when you're in a production environment. That stays up and listens all the time for incoming requests. When it receives a request, it then looks to see if there are any child processes that are running. The child processes meaning that it's called compute geometry, and that's the thing that's Rhino, essentially. That's the thing that's running Rhino and Grasshopper and does all the calculations. It isn't until those get spun up or created that your core hour billing actually starts to take effect. And if, let's say, for example, your users are using your web app or something like that, sending a request, and they then are done, and it doesn't get any requests for a significant amount of time, the parent application will start to shut all of those child processes down. So you're not getting billed over and over. So we have a timeout. Right now the default is an hour, but you can kind of set it for whatever you want. And so it will start to shut those child processes down. You're not getting billed. And then, 6 hours later, somebody sends another request. It checks to see and will handle all the spinning back up and, getting the calculation done. So we have tried to add a number of features to Rhino.Compute to make it user friendly, right? You're still going to have to pay Amazon or Azure for your virtual machine costs and things like that. And that's not something we can control. But from our side, we've really tried to make it reasonable for users.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. I mean, I don't have any use case at the moment, but I can imagine like in the past, like if I was building applications that you can build even right now, a React application maybe, and just not for free, but like get geometry operations that are really complex in any app in a few minutes, right?
Absolutely.
And that's something that will take you ages, or you have to get like a kernel or some other geometry feature that allows you to do that. So maybe going back to Grasshopper and what we were talking about, I was curious that in 2011, you already had an intro to Grasshopper course or some videos online, right? I haven't been able to trace it because the links are broken.
Oh, man. Sorry.
But I wanted to know, like, what moved you to teaching? Do you have a vocation for that? Like, an interest? Are you still doing it? What do you get out of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always enjoyed teaching. And Grasshopper was really a nice avenue for me, especially early on, to explore that. As I mentioned, my first workshop was that one that I taught at CCA that was asking about like, how did you use it for this one project, but also like, what is it? And as I said, the early days, there was a lot of energy, a lot of people that were getting really excited about Grasshopper and what it could do. And they were looking for people to come and teach them. There weren't a lot of classes that universities taught specifically at the time that were really looking at that. And so a lot of times people would just hire me or others to come and teach a workshop, 2-day, 1-day, 3-day kind of thing, and teach their students about, how to use the tools. And so for me, that actually, for several years, I did that quite often. And it was also a great way to kind of see the country in different universities, did some in Europe and even, Canada and things like that. So it was a really great experience. I learned a lot, really enjoyed myself. And then, I ended up going back to school, and still continued to do that. As I've gotten older, and have a family now, the traveling on that side gets a little bit more difficult, but also the requests have sort of dropped down, I think, because it's a much more mature technology. People kind of understand it now. There's a lot more resources online, and also universities are teaching their own classes on it now. There's plenty of instructors now that know how to use it and can teach it. So some of that's gone down, but I'm still doing quite a bit. We're still doing a number of workshops. Now I do it through McNeel, right? But we get a lot of requests at conferences and things like that to teach a workshop on Rhino.Compute and hops and how does that work? Because, we're still developing things that are kind of new. And I think it's the new stuff that people are like, I don't understand how this works. And particularly with Rhino.Compute, it's a little bit different of a model, right? You kind of have to have a little bit better understanding of like web technologies and HTTP requests and stuff like that and servers. So it's not your traditional architect or designer, things like that. That's where I'm coming from as an architect, don't really have that kind of experiences, in my opinion. All of the standard Grasshopper stuff, while it might be daunting at first, it's relatively straightforward in terms of learning. But some of this other stuff it takes a little bit to actually understand. And so I still enjoy doing the teaching, and I'm still getting an opportunity to do it a few times a year.
How do you think the visual programming environment or graphical user interface in Grasshopper and other visual programming environments helps students? Or because it's kind of like an opinionated question. Like, I have seen a lot of debate on whether starting with visual programming might impede in some way people to think on traditional programming later. Do you have any opinions there in whether it's better to?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. If you ask different people, and I've seen David Rutten's response, because he's sort of the one responsible for a lot of the excitement in visual programming. Visual programming is programming to a degree, I think. Even though it's you're not writing text, you're not writing code and things like that, you're still having to figure out how to think about a problem, break it down, and just determine how you're going to actually solve the problem by breaking it down into a series of steps in an algorithm. And so to me, I still think visual programming is really important and is totally a valid way of thinking about programming. I also think it's a bit of a gateway drug because as soon as you start doing it, you want to start to push its limits and see where, things aren't there yet. At least that was the way for me. And that's how I ended up starting to write my own plugins, right? My own components. It was because, there wasn't something that automatically already did the thing that I wanted it to do. And so in that way, it was sort of the inspiration to start to learn how to program, right? How to write, text-based serialized code. Because I was comfortable in Grasshopper, I could still develop in that sort of visual programming environment, but now I'm starting to get behind the scenes a little bit. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting in that question that I did with Firefly, but I think it could really be taken a little bit further for those listening. Firefly is a plugin that sort of connects external microcontrollers like an Arduino. It's sensors and servos and actuators and things like that to Grasshopper and to Rhino eventually. So what that allows you to do is take, real-time sensor information, for example, a light sensor, and use that as an input to control your 3D model. And so you could be designing, let's say you're designing a louver system, right, for a facade that is reactive to changes in light. And you want to demo that for a client or something like that. You can now have a real-time sensor on the table or even mounted to a wall that is picking up the amount of light. And in real time, you're seeing your 3D geometry because it's coupled to Grasshopper. You get to see your 3D geometry changing in real time. You can then take that even further and take those angles, right? If you're rotating a louver system, it's going to be changing angles and things like that, and send that out back to the microcontroller to control a servo motor. So you could have a little model of your louver system, for example, that's now rotating and changing as you change the light sensor, right? The light values. And so it's pretty interesting, I think. One of the things I really got excited about early on was this prototyping environment. I've always enjoyed working with my hands and building things. And it was a great way to sort of mix the physical world and the digital world. One of the downsides of the way Firefly works is that it's constantly sending serial data back and forth over the serial port. So that's how it reads the sensor data and sends it over to Grasshopper and does something. It gets that value for the angle for the louver and sends that back over the serial port for the motor. So it's sending stuff back and forth. But what that means is you're kind of always connected to your laptop and Grasshopper running. Let's say you use Firefly to prototype your thing. You've got it all dialed in. You're using, some remapping and some smoothing and some, all of these different components to get it really where you like it. But now you want it to run autonomously. And to do that, you have to essentially convert your Grasshopper definition into code that can be uploaded to the Arduino, right? Text-based code that then gets compiled and uploaded in machine language onto the Arduino. And that's been difficult for a lot of people. So while I was at the GSE working with Payne, we wrote a code generator that would essentially recursively look upstream in your Grasshopper definition and write Arduino compatible code from your Grasshopper definition. So it sort of takes your visual representation and serializes it back into a textual representation. And what I think is kind of interesting about that is it also lets you look under the hood a little bit, right? It doesn't do it for all components in Grasshopper. Obviously, an Arduino doesn't know how to respond to a curve, but it, if you want to learn how smoothing works or remapping a number into a different number set, all of these things, you can now see how to write that code in real time. So it lets you look under the hood. Grasshopper is a bit of a black box, right? You just see the visual component, but you don't know how under the hood it's working. And so I think from a teaching perspective and learning how to program, it's kind of an interesting tool in that it also lets you kind of see how, if I have this visual programming, how can I actually convert that into a text-based representation and do that.
I think that as long as from the beginning, the limitations of the environment are explained, right? For example, looping or like, as you say, in real time thing or asynchronous calls or, things that are really common nowadays in programming environments are harder in the visual programming language, right? And many times we just try to force it there, but at some point you can say, this is so much easier if you just get out for a bit of Grasshopper and do this in this other system. But yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts. So that's really cool. I would be interested on learning about your take on open source and like releasing tools for free or like closed source.
I'm a big fan of giving away things for free, but I also haven't necessarily exposed a lot of my code as open source. Part of that's because a lot of the stuff that I did early on was really poorly coded. And I was kind of embarrassed to put it out there. I actually started writing Firefly with Jason Kelly Johnson, who's another professor out in San Francisco. But I started writing it as a way to learn how to code. I didn't really have a whole lot of programming background back when I was first doing this, but I was interested. And so I started in VB.net at the time. And so I created this library of components. And then as I started developing more, I sort of made different projects and switched to C# and other things. But in fact, I'm very embarrassed because now I look back at the code. I've been thinking about writing a second version of Firefly, a rewrite. And it would probably be a ground up because the existing code base is just a mess. Definitely am of the opinion that I want to help the community as much as I can. And so, the primer was always given away for free. Firefly is given away for free. Monolith was always a free application. And so I also try to take the stance of how do you monetize this stuff? By doing it for free and giving it away, you sort of start to establish a profile, a name, whatever you want to call it, for yourself. And then you start getting these more excitement and invitations to come teach a workshop. And from that, those networking connections and things like that. And so taking the long view for me has sort of helped sort of establish myself and make those connections where had I charged, I probably would have had a lot less connections to people. Really the only thing I've tried to monetize, and I made a little hardware shield for Firefly, which just a shield, for those, again, who aren't aware, it's a little thing that you can just plug in and it already has everything set up. So this little shield, you just plug it into the Arduino and it has a light sensor and a little joystick and some sliders and some buttons and some LEDs, and it can control motors. So it's like a full-fledged sort of prototyping thing that you don't have to wire up your own circuit to do. You could just plug it in and start and go. And because that's hardware, because I have to pay for, all of those, components, I do charge for that because that's a product, but that's a slightly different thing than, the software and everything like that, where I can control that. And it's really just time versus any kind of monetary expense from my end.
Yeah, I think I end up taking a similar approach. Like I end up open sourcing a lot of the code, a lot of the things I do, also thinking like nobody's gonna spend the time trying to understand it, right? It ends up being like some people find certain things useful at some moments in time because they're working on similar things and they even sometimes comment that's useful. That's really rewarding for me. I think also charging certain things, unless you have a super big audience that you know who you're aiming at, it reduces adoption and readership, let's say. Or if I were to put all these podcast episodes that I'm trying to let people know that this exists and build an audience, I'll be like putting a barrier
paywall,
paywall that actually ends up being worse for me, right?
Agreed.
So I also think I play the long run game, and I think, that's why in most podcasts or most channels the model is advertisement, because it lets people watch it for free or listen for free, but then there's another way of monetizing.
We need to advertise it on code on GitHub, get advertisers.
Yeah, that's right? Like comments. That's a great idea. Like every open source
commit, you get an advertise.
Yeah, or like between every code comment you put like, listen to Getting Simple podcast. That would be, I never thought about that. Actually, I have a content management system, and when you look for the code, you see like view the source of the web page at the top says like, hi, it's Nono. This was built with Laravel folder. So at least for developers might be a tool for discoverability.
But coming back to the question, I did want to point out that because I've been working on Rhino.Compute, and again, this was sort of done, but the decision to open source compute was made long before I started. So I joined McNeel in October of last year. But it's an open source product, so anybody can download and look at the source. So I am contributing to that. But download, look at the source, and even make commits and pull requests and make enhancements. And we've actually had some really, it's not often, but we've had a couple users who have added some pull requests that really have been really well thought out and well documented pull requests. And so we've been able to include those changes in some of the code.
Yeah, and I'm also curious because I see that the Grasshopper Forum has been really active, and you've also been an active user throughout the years. How do you engage with users today?
That's a good question. So early days, Grasshopper used to be a website that was hosted, that McNeel hosted on Ning, N-I-N-G. And that was an interesting forum at the time. It got a lot of traffic. It wasn't necessarily very well organized, but it was also kind of interesting how they presented images and videos and things like that. It was very easy to see new updates from people. So, if I did a new example where I did something with, a new sensor or something like that, I could post a video there and people could immediately see it and comment. Daniel Piker was a big hit. Obviously, he's the author of a physics plugin called Kangaroo, but he would always do these really compelling videos, and they would just immediately blow people's minds. And but like I said, the actual answering questions and on that platform was a little bit difficult. And so the McNeel team decided to switch to Discourse forum. And I know they've been really trying for the last several years to kind of build that community up. So the Ning one had a lot of traffic, but it wasn't necessarily a great forum to figure out how to ask questions. Discourse is much more like a Stack Overflow model. It's much easier to access and answer questions and things like that, find solutions. But I think still to this day, we could do a better job at being able to showcase, new people's, work and videos and things like that. We're working on that. We're trying. But it is still a very active forum. I think it's getting better. So for us, when I joined the McNeel team, one of the things I realized, and one of the, that they kind of explain, is that they don't follow the same model that many software teams do, where they have sales teams and things like that. They go out and, try to sell licenses. We have almost no sales team, really. I hope the salespeople we don't really have salespeople. We rely on customer service to, generate enthusiasm and get, people to eventually buy a license. So we're all encouraged, developers, technical support people, everybody in the company is encouraged to participate on the forum. and talk to users and find out what they're lacking, what they need, what features, because that's how we determine what to develop. The interesting part, I think, too, having worked at Autodesk and at McNeel, is that there aren't really many product managers. We don't have any product managers. We don't have people that are above me that are saying, you got to work on this today and then work on this tomorrow, things like that. I have had that in the past, and you're probably more familiar with it than I am. For us, they hire people who are, sort of self-motivated to, find what they're interested in and continue to develop those. And so one way we do that is by interacting with our customers, right, on the forum. And so really, it's kind of up to each user. We have individual projects that we're working on and so on and so forth. But we really try to prioritize customer service because that's our way in. It helps us know what to focus on, and it also helps spread the word. Hopefully, that McNeel cares about its customers and has really good customer service, and hopefully that eventually filters out to people wanting to buy the software.
Do you have a Discord channel?
I don't.
It seems like many new platforms, I myself directly go into Discord and more real-time interaction instead of going for forums, right. Even though I think the structure of a forum, it's like people are informally creating a post that is going to stay there, and many other people are going to come through Google and search the same thing. Whereas in Discord, I think things just on the timeline get lost, and there's no way to discover past things more than just searching and trying to reverse engineer a conversation, right? So yeah, no, I think it's good.
Too, there was a focus to try to really funnel people to this one source, right? I think if we created a Discord server, now we've kind of got two different things. We've got a Discord server where we can interact, and we've got a forum, but that's hard on us because you've now got to monitor two different things. And two, you're kind of splitting your audience into, are they going to go to the Discord or are they going to go to a forum? And now, you might only get half the number either way, and so I think we've really tried to focus, let's just try to get people to go to this one source of truth and really try to build that up. Also, I think when they did it, right, they probably Discord servers, I think they switched probably 2016. I could be rough on that, but somewhere around there. And I don't know the history of Discord servers and things like that, but I think they've kind of become more popular more recently. And so they probably, made a decision early on to go to this discourse model. And then, I think they've just kept going there. I think, talking about videos too, we have really tried to start building up our learning content as well. I think that's another thing that we try to do pretty well. We haven't historically always done. We try to do well documentation, but we haven't. We're finding more and more people tend to like these videos, and so we're really trying to build up our video content library so that we can sort of explain how to model, how to do Grasshopper things for new users.
Okay, so maybe at this point you can tell us where can people find these things online, and also where can they find you online?
Okay. I tend to be a little bit more hidden. Rhino.3D.com and Grasshopper3D.com. I forget the actual. We'll have to post the link to the Rhino Grasshopper Forum because I don't have the URL exactly, but I think Rhino3D.com is a good place to start, and then from there you can link. There's links to the forum and so on and so forth. And then we also have learning pages, right? So there's everything from the learning pages to just learning how to model and things, and then we also have our developer documentation, which is a little bit more focused on people who are wanting to develop programming and things like that. But they're guides that really help you figure out how to navigate the Rhino Common API and things like that. And so we do try to, obviously, it's a hard thing to manage. You've got a lot of content, and we've generated a lot of content, and it's kind of all over the place. And so we are trying to centralize and make our web experience a lot better and easier to understand for users. But that takes time. And we're always, trying to improve it. So we try to look for feedback and say, this isn't working. Like, how do we, get it to look better? Also, when you launch Rhino, every time you launch Rhino, there's a sort of list on the right that's like what's happening. They send out a lot of e-blasts and things like that. But we have like a running blog that sort of says what are some of the new features and new things that are happening, and workshops that are happening in different areas. And so every time you launch Rhino, you should have a list of links that you can click right there, and it'll take you as well to some of these pages. For me personally, I don't do a whole lot of social media. I have sort of a private account on a couple things, but I don't really do Twitter or Instagram or really any of those things. So I'm a little bit more of a private person when it comes to that. I think early on, I did well in positioning myself. I happened to be at the right place at the right time and a couple of things, right? Grasshopper being one of them. I sort of happened to be interested and available to sort of start when Grasshopper was really starting. And so I happened to just be at the right place at the right time. And then I did the primer. And so like I said, it was sort of the right place at the right time. And I did try to really build my name and get my name out there and so on and so forth. But as I've gotten a little bit older, I've kind of become less and less socially aware. I get nervous about the privacy and how much stuff is out there. And so for me, I tend to, and to that end, I've kind of seen, some of that stature kind of fall off. So there's a catch-22, or not catch-22, but I get a little bit nervous, but it also means that had I kept pushing on some of the social media, out there, getting my name out there, Twitter and so on and so forth, I might be in a different position. But that's the choices we make, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, you can always start if you change your mind, but I think it's good.
But I can't say I'm always available, especially through email, for technical questions. So, the email address is andy.payne@mcneel.com. And so any of those things, we do try to be very accessible. And so, anyone and everyone can feel free to send me questions and things like that. And we do try to answer those as quickly as we can.
Can you tell us how you got started programming?
That's a good question. I started by doing what I think a lot of people try to do is they have an idea in their head and want to try to explore that in some way. I was always interested in electronics a bit. I didn't have any kind of experience with that growing up, but I had seen some projects done by other people, and so I decided to take a workshop, an Arduino workshop in San Francisco, just sort of a weekend thing. And that sort of gave me a little bit of an insight of how the electronic side worked. But the concept was, how do I take this and link it to Grasshopper? So I think I did what most people do who don't know what they're doing, is they just start Googling and reaching out on forums and say how do I do this? And I did get some help on forums early on about how to connect to the serial port and things like that. And eventually I was able to cobble together, a component that could, read information in. And then the next step is, how do you read it back out or send it back out? And so, I think for me, it's really just about the curiosity. You have something in your head that you really just want to do, and you just have to pursue that. And that's really how I started to program. I didn't grow up writing code. I think I took maybe one class or things like that. And I have historically not taken a whole bunch of programming classes. It's sort of self-taught. And that's probably why the code that I wrote early on was so horrible. But you just start to explore, and credit to David and the rest of the McNeel team who made developing components or plugins relatively easy, right? It may not seem easy at first. It's a bit of a steep curve if you're very new to programming and things like that. But the more you do it, the more you realize it's a pretty accessible platform. Particularly the C# and VB and Python components that you can just develop directly in the application. But I think those are good ways to start to explore an idea. And then like I said, there's lots of information online. And you just have to have a project and start it. And so for me, that was Firefly, but I think the same can be for a lot of people.
I want to comment on two things that you've mentioned. One of them you just touched on. Many people want to switch careers, right? And they, for some reason, they said, yeah, I'm taking this Learn Python course or this JavaScript initiation course. And it's really easy to get bored. I would mention this for people who are thinking that they want to improve coding, because if you don't have a goal, an objective, like for example, you were tinkering with a physical thing, like a microprocessor that might switch a light on or off, and it has some way of seeing the results and the rewards and what you can use that for. But if you're just learning in the abstract, it's like you're studying English all your life without going to an English-speaking country and practicing, right?
Well, and I think I've done some of those videos, and you're right. It's kind of like homework, right? What I mean by that is, like, I think you have to find something that you're passionate about and curious about. And so a project that you're sort of driving, that you have control over and are wanting to do, makes the development process, that learning process, so much more achievable or interesting. Whereas if you're just sort of going through the motions, following a series of tutorials that somebody else has written, out, that's great. It's fun and it can be good, and you can hopefully apply a lot of that down the road. But at the same time, while you're doing it, it can be boring. It can be a lot like homework, and you're just sort of going through the motions.
Yeah, many times. I mean, when you get to you're already programming, it does make sense to go back and go to see videos that are more specific to learning a technique. You're going to acquire a new skill that you say, okay, I can apply this later to manage lists or asynchronous processes or online communication. But then you need to apply it just to test it. You usually learn the thing and then test it for something. And I mean, you can see on the YouTube channel, I can see that many people have a target in mind that they want to do. And that's why they get to your video. It's like, I want to automate uploading, I don't know, like 20 or like 100 videos to YouTube. So they get to your video because they search how to upload it.
Yeah, sure.
Nobody's going to go and say, okay, I'm going to upload, I'm going to see how to upload a video to YouTube just in case someday it's useful, right? And then the other thing that I think I relate to is coding skills evolution, right? Like I see also my projects back in time and how I did things. And I think it's great that you don't like the code in early Firefly, because that means that now you have the possibility of looking from a perspective where you say, I've learned a lot, or I can see that that's bad. The worrisome thing would be if you didn't realize that was not the best code that you can do now, right?
Yeah.
So that would be also an encouragement note to people who have things and they don't know if they should release, because I've seen people that get really self-conscious about, this is not ready, I don't have documentation, or just put it out there. It depends on what you're doing, but sometimes people might find it useful. They can learn from it. And I don't know. I would encourage that as well.
Yeah, sure. You make totally valid points. And like I said, for me, I think it really just comes down to, the individual curiosity of the person. And I think we all are curious people. I think a lot of us, have these inklings in the back of our head of like, we want to visualize something. And I think that's sort of, why, sort of taking a left turn here. But I know you've probably been keeping up with all of the ML stuff with, these text to image translators, Mid-Journey and Stable Diffusion and DALL-E. And I think that's an interesting thing that's happening now. You're starting to see these people that, it's allowing them to sort of visualize their curiosity in different ways that they hadn't really begun to explore. I think it'll be interesting to see how people then take that, right? Are they just going to take it at face value and show it to the client? Or is it really like an ideation process, like a back and forth with this AI as a way to sort of augment your own process?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is how it has exploded in every field. Like you're seeing everyone trying to bring it home and trying to apply it to design, architecture, interface design,
graphic
CGI,
design.
graphic design, anything. And I'm not sure where it's going to go. I know that it is transforming the way that we design and we do things. There's also the concern that, we're going to lose the human craft, or like we're going to be prompting text bar instead of like actually thinking what we need to do. And
I think it's an interesting question that is going to be posed as these things become more and more popular, right? Obviously, a lot of the models are trained on thousands or millions of images from the internet. And so that means all of the stuff that's been published thus far, by different artists are now part of this library, if you will, of images that it draws from. And so you can now say, build a house in the style of X, or, give me a drawing in the style of this particular artist. And that artist obviously has spent a lot of time thinking and developing their own style, right? And I can certainly see how it's now being sort of co-opted and sort of degraded a bit, taking sort of and trivializing the work that they've done to a point where now you can do it in a matter of seconds. And I can see how that would be really difficult for a lot of people and a lot of artists. And then obviously you're seeing other ethical questions about the AI stuff, about biases that are internal, some of the stuff that Shelby Doyle has talked about and things like that, how it's...
For me, I've played with DALL-E a bit since they opened the closed beta. Now I think it's completely public, so anyone can sign up and use 20 or 50 credits a month or something like that. I've been playing a lot. You get caught, right, with the prompt types and the, let's say, modifiers that you use. Like a modifier can be 4K resolution or a fresh paint or hand drawing or bokeh photo, right? Like those are all modifiers that you can add to the description of what items you're seeing or what you're seeing on the picture. I've used the one that I've got in love is Edward Hopper, by Edward Hopper. Like if he had drawn that, because the colors that his most famous paints, or at least the ones I know have, are like these light blue skies with like high saturation and really green fields and happy people.
Interesting, because the one I know that Edward Hopper is Nighthawks, right? The one that's the diner. It's so kind of a darker
mood. And so, well, at least some of the things that I personally call my attention at museums that I like and say, I like this kind of old painting, but that looks really poppy or something, right? So I use that modifier a lot to generate things, and some of them I love that. I usually put like blue sky, trees, birds and grass and whatever by Edward Hopper. And what I was coming to is those have been really easy for me to generate, right? I've been iterating, I generate variations, I change the description, and I've, let's say, created with this tool some images that look like, or illustrations that look like Edward Hopper paintings. And that makes me think, if I had actually studied his artwork and I was trying to draw things from real life as he did, trying to mimic his style, that probably would have been hours and hours of work and a lot of dedication, and I would value those pieces a lot, right? Each piece, it would have taken a lot of time to do. And now these images that I've generated are not of so much value to me, because even though the results are maybe even better of what I could have done, I'm undervaluing them because they were super
easy.
Took you a
second to make.
Yeah. So that's the part that I don't like. It's like we are putting less value in not just the price that you would be willing to pay to buy some illustration or some drawing, but on the pieces that we can make as humans.
Effort used to make it. Same thing is true with probably anything that we make, but even digital content, right? Modeling. I'm going back to Rhino, McNeel, the stuff that I've done in the past, because no one wants to spend days and days developing a model. In fact, that's our job as developers, is try to make it easy as possible. There is something about the craft, right? The time spent, the quality and time spent that you invest in developing your ideas into a 3D model or something like that. There's something about that investment that makes it worthwhile, and that's sort of the design process. When you sort of have an easy button where you can just press it and it generates your building for you, it does take it takes the design process away from you, but it also sort of trivializes it a bit, I think.
So I think, if I'm not wrong, I have a mini essay on the blog about the concept that we're talking about that is it's referred to as the IKEA effect.
Okay.
So you have a really like a $5, $20 piece of furniture, but because maybe even you did it with friends or with your partner or something, there's this moment that you had to lay down all the pieces, look at the manual, and spend maybe, I don't know, 45 minutes assembling this thing. Then you mentally put more value into that item than it actually has, because you've put, as you said,
you built it,
a lot of effort. So for you, it would be really easy to give away, let's say, a $10 table if you had bought it on Craigslist and now you're selling it, than if you actually bought it original and assembled it, and even more if there is a story behind it that you put that, oh, I built this with my kids or with my friends or whatever. And so I think there is part of that. It's like the effort of making something makes you less willing to give it away or want to charge more. And if that happens to art and how we envision, because art at the end of the day, we're talking about illustrations as something you could sell, but I see also art as a self-expression medium, right? And we're kind of like trying to do as few craft as we can.
So I bring up the question for you then. Who becomes the artist in DALL-E or Midjourney? Is it the person who writes the text prompt, or is it the programmers who develop the model, the AI, right? As they're the ones who essentially built the model and explained how, built the concepts of how it all goes together. I think it's an interesting question of how much authorship should be given to the person who actually generates the prompt, for example, and the person behind it. And the same can be, I guess, true for, to a degree, some of the tools that we all make, right? Me personally doing some of the stuff with Rhino and Grasshopper. And so, obviously the authorship is more of a step back, right? Someone who's designing in Grasshopper, that's their design. But also you do feel a bit, I look at some of the videos that are posted online that use Firefly, right? That are using these sensors to drive something. And you do feel like you had a piece in that, even though it's their work. I'm not trying to claim any, ownership or authorship or anything like that, but you do feel like you contributed some way into that work to a degree. And so, they probably don't see it that way, and that's fine. I'm not, it's a different model, but I do wonder where the programmer, the guy behind the scenes who writes the software or the stuff, where their fit is in that.
So I don't have the right answer for that, but my thought is when you have a pencil or you have like even Photoshop or Grasshopper of these tools, the canvas is sort of empty, right? That you start with the tools that you're given, and of course the medium and the tools are going to determine highly the things that you're going to do, right? If you use a brush in Photoshop, it's going to determine the type of drawing you do. If you go to AutoCAD or to Rhino and start with the polyline tool, it's going to determine or constrain what you can do. So the difference, I think, is that DALL-E is a program that is actually as if in Grasshopper you were telling, build like a tower with like 3 stories and blah, blah, blah for me. And it was actually feeling, it was actually creating nodes and doing the things for you. So, we're entering in that the program is actually taking the brush from you and painting.
Exactly.
So I think, I don't see... it's complicated. If you're just you could say that if you're just putting a prompt and generating a thing, you put that prompt, you had let's say the idea, the originality is like to write that prompt and get that image. But there is people who go farther and maybe start like getting an image and like merging that with another or like creating permutations. So there's also an effort there in using this tool now to get to a good result.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even with just like the silliest prompt, you can end up with like a initial canvas that is already a finished piece. And, we've also seen on the news that there have been like a drawing contest owned by the AI, blah, blah, blah. It made it to the New York Times and I think New Yorker. And so I don't have an answer. I think we're
I don't know that there is one. It's more of a just open debate.
Philosophical debate.
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to ask you as well, if there was one thing that AI could do for us today, might be in our daily lives, on our work, what would you want it to be?
That's a tough question. Because it's so, we're obviously drawn, or the things that come to mind, I think, unprepared for that question. Things that come to mind are obviously things that we're already starting to see, right? It's sort of always around us, right? The thing that scares me, I think, is a lot of the stuff that's being built into social media and things like that influence our decisions and things like that without us really understanding or knowing that it's happening. And particularly like when your phone hears conversations, right, that you're talking about, and now you have ads for something that, you know, it was in your pocket. It wasn't even like on and listening or something, or it was listening, but we didn't know that it was listening. And now we have advertisements for products or something that we were just talking about. Or even I've noticed that like my children have something on the TV, like a cartoon or something, and now something on my phone shows up on that about that cartoon. And so that sort of stuff freaks me out a little bit, and particularly the biases that it sort of imposes on people without sort of their knowledge. But you know, I think it's inevitable that it's going to permeate really all aspects of our life. I think, whether we know it or not. You know, obviously the social media aspect's already there. We're seeing it in banking. We're seeing it in entertainment. We're starting to see it in design, right? I think the stuff you're seeing, and a lot of stuff you're doing, right? You're working at a design software company focusing on AI and machine learning. So the stuff that you're doing will have a direct impact, right? And so I think it will be interesting to see how that shapes our design process, and whether that's good or bad. You know, our whole conversation that we've been having about DALL-E and Midjourney and so on and so forth, like we seem to be kind of split on its benefits and the consequences of it. And so it'll be interesting to see how some of those things play out.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, we don't refer as heuristics as something that is changing the world, but we do about AI and ML. But I think that more and more, especially, let's say, not traditional machine learning, but like not general artificial intelligences, right? Machine learning is, as you said, permeating in many different fields. And I think slowly we're going to stop talking about it with so much hype. It's just going to be one more way of solving problems, right? It's unlocking problems that were not possible to solve with heuristics by having like huge data sets. But in terms of, for example, at work or other utilities, we're just using machine learning for things that you can do in other ways. For example, like an energy simulation, but faster with like a prediction that is not super accurate, but is super fast.
Yeah, no doubt there's benefits to it, right? I mean, obviously, there wouldn't be so much investment in it if it wasn't for good reasons, right? I think it's just the average person probably doesn't think about the consequences enough, because they're not always visible of what those consequences might be. But certainly the benefits are pretty profound. And so I think the big question moving forward is how much are you willing to give away, or whatever those consequences are, do they outweigh the potential benefits? Because I think in a lot of ways that answer is yes. You're speeding up a process that would normally take many hours. Now you've got it in minutes. And so that has a huge time saving.
One thing I wanted to make sure that we talk about, even if briefly, we've had Panagiotis Michalatos before on this podcast. You've referred to him as Pan some instances in this podcast because you worked with him on a few projects, including Monolith. So I wanted to know what your experience has been working with him, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I've been fortunate. I was very fortunate to have met Panagiotis. The same year I started at the GSD was his first year. And, you know, you sort of recognize his genius kind of right away, even first class or first lecture, whatever it is. And so given the stuff that I was there to do, my research interests and things like that, I really gravitated towards wanting to just soak it all in, be around him as much as I could to sort of understand how he thought and see how he programs and stuff like that. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to work for several years, both at the GSD and then afterwards with Monolith and then at Autodesk. And the one word that comes to mind, like I said, is genius. Sort of anybody who's sat down with him, next to him while he's sort of helping you debug a problem, it's pretty evident really quickly how how his brain sort of works in a slightly different way than say most of us. And I think it's kind of compelling and sort of in awe of the amount of knowledge that he has, just from a mathematics standpoint, obviously machine learning, AI, but also structural engineering and things like that. He brings so much to the table that a lot of us can't really keep up.
Awesome. Yeah. No, I think, and I also think that he engages, might be through student projects or other collaboration, he absorbs and tries to engage as if projects were his own. So as if he was doing that, he has so many ideas that sometimes it's more like he's delegating other people to build them for, not for him, but like for themselves, but throughout his way of understanding those ideas.
He's also just relentless in his pursuit. Like particularly, it was probably before you got to the GSD, but his first year, again, he was new to teaching. So I don't think he really knew how to say no to students. And he was there 18 hours a day helping students. I mean, just relentless. People were just always there asking him questions, and he would always have time and sit down and help them figure out what they were doing or what they were doing wrong. And, I think that's been always really incredible, seeing that his willingness to help people, his willingness to sit down and explain concepts and things like that, is really just quite profound.
Would you have any advice for young people?
Stay curious. That's kind of a cliche, probably, but it's really something that I try to explore. Every day. I think for me, it's what's kind of driven my whole process. Ever since I have been in school, was this idea of just kind of exploring these ideas that were sort of in the back of my head, and just this relentless pursuit of trying to figure it out. You're going to hit roadblocks. You're going to get stumped. It's going to be really frustrating. But to me, the aha moment, you figure out that problem and you finally figure out how it works. To me, that's what you get, that sort of endorphin boost that makes it all worthwhile, right? You get that one moment of clarity that you've now figured out how the problem should be solved. And that's what makes it worth it. And so, just following that relentless curiosity is sort of, I think, important.
What's your definition of success?
I think it depends on context, right? How do you mean success in what context?
I mean, as I've seen on many previous interviews, success always comes as something that is super idiosyncratic, something that you have your own definition for it. So I guess success in life for you to be content every day, right? Not being at unease with like, I'm not doing the right thing, or...
For me, it's important about family, right? I strongly believe, and fortunately, I work at a great company that also values the things that I tend to value. But work-life balance is really important. Family, friends. I strongly believe in supporting my family. I kind of pour as much as I can into them. And so success for me is being able to still explore the things that I'm passionate about from a work perspective and career perspective, but maintaining, that balance that gives you, the ability to sort of be there for your family and friends, and also have some. So for me, success is, essentially being able to juggle both of those. And that's not always the case for a lot of people, but I'm lucky to have found a spot that I can do that.
One last question. This is a la Tim Ferriss, because this is a question that he's been doing to many people. What would be an item of $100 or less that you've bought recently that has improved your life in any way?
All right. So we've talked about work-life balance and my pursuit to sort of be able to juggle, family. And one of the things that I really have enjoyed over the last several years is being able to take the skills that I've learned through design, fabrication, making things with my hands, woodworking, things like that, and applying them for things that I can use for my kids. And so a thing that I've really enjoyed doing the last several years is making Halloween costumes. And they've increasingly gotten more sophisticated and complex. but it's also a learning process, right? I've definitely learned new techniques that I wish I had known when I was in school, because some of the things I'm doing now with stupid Halloween costumes could have been applied as architecture models and things like that. But really the stuff that I'm buying are supplies for Halloween costumes. And yet that brings a joy to me, and hopefully will bring a joy to them at some point when they get to actually wear that. But, even though that's just my hobby, it's making things like out in my wood shop or making things like Halloween costumes, and it's kind of silly. The stuff I'm buying is like EVA foam and contact cement and spray paint. But, for me, that brings joy, is the hobbies I get to explore.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks so much for being with us today. So it's been a pleasure. I'm super happy that we could see each other physically, because everything has been remote lately.
It was great to catch up, and I'm really glad you invited me to come.
Yeah. So we'll, as he said, Andy is not super present on social media. I know that you're at least on LinkedIn. So by email or LinkedIn, you can reach out to him. And I guess mainly to ask technical questions or anything that you want to.
Anything.
And I'll also remind everyone that we'll put detailed episode notes of this and any previous episodes at gettingsimple.com/podcast, and that you can submit questions to gettingsimple.com/ask. So there is a form there. You can record a voice note with your phone or your computer, or you can also upload a short video to YouTube that we can answer on the live stream or the podcast. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.